Hey everyone. Tonight we're going to delve into the rather unusual, ambitious, and at times surprisingly eyebrow-free world of medieval beauty standards. This was a world where the ultimate goal wasn't to project health, but rather to appear as if one had just been politely and minimally exerted. So, before you get too comfortable, please take a moment to gently tap that like button and consider subscribing if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, feel free to share in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always quite interesting to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, perhaps dim the lights, maybe turn on a quiet fan for that subtle background hum, and let's gently drift into tonight's historical journey together. In the medieval world, appearing pale wasn't a sign that you needed more sleep. Instead, it was a distinct fashion statement, a subtle social flex, a quiet declaration to the world that proclaimed, "I am far too wealthy to ever need to see the sun. Thank you very much." Unlike today, where a healthy, sun-kissed glow might suggest activities like yoga, drinking smoothies, or a relaxing trip to the coast, medieval beauty flipped that script entirely. Tan skin explicitly meant you worked outdoors, which inherently implied you were poor, which in turn meant gasp, manual labor. And nothing said "not beautiful" in the 14th century, quite like possessing the practical knowledge of how to milk a cow. So, the paler your complexion, the higher your perceived social status. And when we say pale, we don't mean a soft, gentle ivory glow. We're talking translucent, almost porcelain-like skin, often with noticeable vascular undertones. Skin so incredibly light, it looked as though you might have recently been startled by a ghost, or perhaps were a ghost yourself. Of course, nature doesn't always cooperate, especially if you were born with an actual functioning circulatory system. So people actively helped it along. Noble women, and occasionally even men, would apply white lead powder to their faces. This provided that signature corpse-chic glow, and as an added bonus, slowly but surely poisoned you. But beauty, as it always has, came with a price. Some individuals would use vinegar-soaked cloths to attempt to bleach their skin. Others applied a mixture of crushed pearls and egg whites. This concoction not only lightened the face, but also had the rather unique side effect of making one's cheeks feel akin to a stale omelet. Veins were sometimes meticulously painted onto the arms and chest, using blue pigment to further simulate delicacy, because apparently, nothing quite conveyed nobility like feigning that your skin was on the verge of splitting open. Even literature embraced this trend. Romantic poems frequently described women as pale as milk, white as snow, and on one memorable occasion, as the moon in winter, which is a rather poetic way of saying she looked like she might faint. This pale aesthetic wasn't merely about superficial beauty, it was shorthand for social class, perceived purity, and a complete economic disengagement from agricultural labor. If you possessed the means to appear fragile, you were, by medieval standards, unequivocally winning. Beauty in the Middle Ages often demanded a considerable commitment. And by commitment, we specifically mean a slow, decorative form of chemical warfare upon oneself. Because for those relentlessly striving to achieve that prestigious pale complexion, nature simply wasn't sufficient. So they turned to makeup, specifically lead-based white face powder. Yes, lead, as in the substance we now diligently seal off in old buildings. But back then it was considered remarkably cutting edge. The result was a smooth, pale, matte finish, the medieval equivalent of high-coverage foundation. It made the skin appear flawless and eventually feel very much not flawless. White lead powder was produced by combining vinegar and metal, then allowing it to corrode into a white crust that could be ground into a fine powder. Apply that daily and voila, you looked like a luminous, delicate aristocrat with a subtle, secret death wish. And if your skin began to flake, blister, or even fall off in small, discrete chunks, even better. It likely meant the makeup was effectively doing its job. This wasn't a single product routine either. Many added mercury-based rouge for a touch of color or chalk dust for improved staying power. Egg whites were frequently brushed over the face for a smooth, glazed appearance. Basically, if it originated from a barn or an alchemist's shelf, someone, somewhere, had probably rubbed it on their face in the pursuit of elegance. The downside, beyond the obvious slow poisoning, was that lead-based products caused everything from chronic fatigue and skin ulcers to significant hair loss and premature death, symptoms typically not listed on most modern skincare labels. But the fashion endured, because if the choice lay between slowly dying and being mistaken for a peasant, nobility often opted for the scenic route to the grave. Men weren't always immune to these trends either. Some male courtiers also utilized powders or skin treatments, particularly in the later medieval and early Renaissance courts, where image held almost as much importance as lineage, or at least as much as smelling marginally better than your rival. Of all the medieval beauty trends, the obsession with high foreheads may be the most eyebrow-raising, quite literally because people were removing their eyebrows for it. A tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead wasn't merely fashionable, it was considered supremely elegant, intellectually profound, and even divine. It was the architectural marvel of the medieval face. The ideal forehead subtly communicated, "I spend my days serenely reading psalms and gazing pensively out of castle windows," rather than, "I own a shovel." To achieve this noble aesthetic, women resorted to extreme and frankly rather itchy measures. Eyebrows were completely plucked out, and sometimes even scalp hair was meticulously removed, inch by inch, to push the hairline further back. This wasn't a simple trim, this was a full-on forehead expansion project. Medieval grooming manuals advised women to use tweezers, hot cloths, and depilatory creams made from substances like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches, all in the name of showcasing a forehead that could genuinely double as a sundial. The results were striking. Portraits from the era depict women with serene expressions and foreheads so vast you could conceivably host a joust upon them. Combined with their pale skin and soft facial features, this high dome aesthetic became shorthand for refined beauty. It wasn't solely about the face either. Fashion directly supported this look. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples, and hennins, those famous cone-shaped hats, all helped to pull the hairline up or at least discreetly hide the area where your eyebrows used to reside. And this wasn't merely some isolated castle trend. From England to France to Italy, noble women embraced the high forehead style, while artists and poets reinforced it by praising women whose faces appeared to begin somewhere near the crown of their heads. Of course, not everyone could afford the time or the tools to meticulously pluck themselves into perfection. So, in a moment of medieval ingenuity, some women ingeniously faked it by drawing their new foreheads slightly higher and covering the rest with headbands or veils. That's right, the Middle Ages had their own version of contouring. It just involved a lot more fabric. In medieval Europe, eyebrows weren't merely underappreciated, they were actively eliminated. While modern trends might celebrate bold brows, feathered arches, and TikTok tutorials, in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were largely seen as unnecessary facial clutter. To achieve the ideal look, women meticulously plucked their eyebrows into near non-existence or entirely erased them. Why? Because a bare, smooth forehead was considered the epitome of elegance and refinement, and any visible sign of actual hair growth completely disrupted this desired aesthetic. Eyebrows were basically perceived as stubborn weeds in the garden of the face. Some individuals went even further and completely shaved the brow area, ensuring that not a single strand interfered with their alabaster, high-domed glory. It's the kind of dedication that would make modern beauty influencers blink twice, mostly because there were no brow pencils readily available to draw them back in. To remove their brows, medieval women utilized tweezers, wax, pumice stones, or for the particularly daring, mixtures containing quicklime, vinegar, or even arsenic. Yes, arsenic. Because nothing quite says dedication to your look like risking mild facial melting. This was more than just a fleeting fad. Art from the period, ranging from illuminated manuscripts to oil portraits, consistently confirms the widespread trend. Noble women are frequently depicted with smooth foreheads and seemingly expressionless eyes, framed by nothing but skin. The resulting look is either serene or, depending on the lighting, slightly alien. Interestingly, the no-brow trend wasn't entirely uniform across Europe. In some regions, thin or lightly arched brows persisted, especially as cultural influences from the Middle East and Byzantine Empire filtered through trade and warfare. But by and large, the prevailing message was clear. If people could see your eyebrows, you were doing it incorrectly. And this wasn't exclusively for women. Men, particularly those closely associated with court life, occasionally trimmed or subtly groomed their brows as part of a broader aesthetic of refinement. However, full removal was rare among males, unless, of course, they had genuinely lost them during a particularly heated theological debate. What this all reveals is that medieval beauty ideals were not about appearing natural. They were about appearing meticulously curated, symbolic, and perhaps just a little bit angelic. Angels, after all, rarely have brows in art. Coincidence? Possibly, but it certainly worked for them. In the Middle Ages, having a touch of color in your cheeks was considered desirable. But like most aspects of medieval life, there were strict rules, potential social risks, and a vague chance of eternal damnation. The ideal was a subtle blush, as if you had just overheard a mildly scandalous poem or briefly stepped outdoors for 30 seconds, but certainly not long enough to acquire a tan, heaven forbid. A gentle rose hue on the cheeks suggested youth, fertility, and a general state of survival. All these qualities were highly attractive, particularly if you could manage to maintain them past the age of 28. However, you absolutely couldn't appear as though you were trying to achieve this look. Applying rouge was considered an act of vanity, and vanity was suspiciously close to sin. The church, predictably, was not amused by women smearing color on their faces, unless, of course, they were nobility or doing it humbly, which remains a theological gray area scholars are still trying to define. Still, women found ways to improvise. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, crushed strawberries, mulberries, or even cochineal, a deep red pigment derived from crushed insects. Yes, bugs. Because beauty, as we know, has never been entirely without its unsavory aspects. Some women simply rubbed their cheeks to stimulate that natural flush, while others used mixtures of red ochre or wine sediment, dabbed carefully to avoid detection by both disapproving clergy and judgmental neighbors. For the truly wealthy, rouge could be made from red lead or cinnabar, both of which were incredibly toxic. But the prevailing logic was something along the lines of, I may die young, but I'll die pink-cheeked and socially respected. Rouge was typically applied with a cloth, fingers, or whatever tool was available that hadn't just been used to season a stew. Access to mirrors was limited, so many women relied on instinct, muscle memory, or the occasional honest maid. Of course, if your blush was too visible, you risked being accused of imitating prostitutes, or even worse, French courtiers. The horror. The objective was always modest enhancement, never a theatrical statement. And if someone complimented your glow, you were expected to vehemently deny everything and mutter something vague about the wind. Even nuns occasionally wore a discreet touch of rouge, supposedly only on feast days. Because nothing quite says, I serve the Lord, like a tasteful dab of beetroot applied subtly behind the cloister. In medieval Europe, if your hair didn't look as though it had been kissed by holy light, or possibly stolen from a cherubic angel in a painting, you were already starting at a disadvantage. Blonde hair, in particular, was the undisputed medieval gold standard. It was consistently associated with youth, striking beauty, virtue, and in case you needed divine endorsement, the Virgin Mary was frequently depicted as a blonde, even though geographically speaking, she was almost certainly not. But realism was considered far less important than radiating a sense of celestial brilliance. If you were naturally born with blonde hair, congratulations, you were considered blessed and probably managed to avoid a few chores. However, natural blondness didn't always endure, especially into adulthood. So, medieval women took matters into their own hands and sometimes into bubbling cauldrons. Homemade hair lightening concoctions included ingredients like saffron, chamomile, ash, honey, and lye. These mixtures were applied liberally, then left to bake under the sun in a method known as sunbasking. It worked best if you possessed the patience of a nun and the skin of a salamander. Some recipes even incorporated urine, which was believed to aid in lifting hair color. Whose urine? That particular detail was less regulated, but as long as it imparted that desired celestial shimmer to your hair, it was deemed worth it. Beauty, as it always has been, was often a little bit disgusting. Hair texture also mattered significantly. Loose, long, wavy locks were the ideal, preferably cascading down your back like a divine curtain. But this luxurious display was strictly reserved for unmarried women. Once married, your golden mane was expected to be meticulously hidden under veils, nets, and various head wraps. Because apparently the very moment you said "I do," your hair suddenly became a national security risk. For noble women, hair was often intricately braided, twisted, or tucked into elaborate styles, especially when attending court or religious events. These elaborate hairstyles were frequently accessorized with luxurious silk ribbons, precious beads, or delicate embroidery, just in case you needed to subtly remind everyone in the room that you certainly didn't shear sheep for a living. Men weren't entirely left out either. While not subjected to quite the same intense scrutiny, men with thick, golden locks were often romanticized in poetry and art. Knights with flowing hair charging into battle were, in essence, the medieval version of shampoo commercials. In medieval Europe, hair was a lot like money. If you possessed it, you didn't necessarily flaunt it, unless, of course, you were attempting to secure a marriage. Then, quite suddenly, it transformed into a strategic asset. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose, symbolizing purity and innocence. Though, it couldn't be too loose, unless you were explicitly aiming for the ethereal forest maiden look, which was only socially acceptable if, say, you were an actual saint or undergoing martyrdom. Otherwise, a gentle, neat braid would suffice. But once married, your hair was immediately banished from public view. Congratulations! You now had a husband and a clear obligation to wrap your locks more tightly than a monastery's wine budget. Enter the world of veils, wimples, nets, and coifs, a medieval wardrobe of modesty that could make even the most radiant blonde disappear under 3 layers of unassuming beige linen. These coverings weren't merely modest, they were highly practical. They protected hair from smoke, lice, and any unsolicited compliments from wandering troubadours. The most dedicated women layered their coverings. A coif, a close-fitting cap, might be worn under a veil, which could then be pinned beneath a wimple that meticulously wrapped under the chin. The overall effect? You looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich, and that was precisely the goal. But fashion is rarely content with mere function. As time progressed, headwear became increasingly elaborate. Nets were intricately embroidered with shimmering gold thread. Veils were starched into dramatic geometric shapes. Some noble women even wore silken cages for their braids, accessorized with sparkling jewels and tiny bells, because nothing quite says subtle beauty like jingling gently whenever you turn your head. In many cultures, concealed hair was directly linked to morality. A covered head was seen as modest and virtuous. Exposed hair on a married woman, however, could lead to unflattering comparisons to a lady of the night, or even worse, a French woman. Of course, some women subtly rebelled. They would allow a small curl to artfully slip out, or wear translucent veils that technically counted as covered, while still allowing the world to admire their carefully dyed strands. Medieval loopholes were alive and well. If medieval beauty adhered to one unspoken rule, it was this: taller is nobler. And we're not talking about your legs. By the 15th century, women across Europe began embracing a fashion trend that quite literally elevated their appearance: the hennin. You know the one. Those towering, cone-shaped hats that looked as though they were designed by someone who spent a little too much time contemplating church steeples. The hennin wasn't just mere headwear. It was, in essence, a social ladder you wore. These hats could reach upwards of 2 feet, sometimes even more, especially among the French and Burgundian elite. The taller the hennin, the higher your perceived status, and consequently, the more doors you likely smacked into on your way to dinner. Often meticulously crafted from fine silk, luxurious velvet, or rich brocade, hennins were structured with delicate wireframes, giving them that dangerously aerodynamic shape. A sheer veil usually gracefully cascaded from the tip, adding movement, an air of mystery, and a good chance of accidentally catching fire from candles. Now, getting your hair to fit neatly under one of these elaborate creations was an art in itself. Hair was typically braided and painstakingly stuffed up into the cone, or sometimes completely shaved around the forehead. That forehead real estate again, to help the hennin sit properly. Comfort was clearly not a part of the design brief. But hennins weren't the only vertical obsession. Some women wore heart-shaped escoffions, which resembled 2 croissants delicately glued to either side of the head, or butterfly hennins, where veils were spread out like delicate wings. Excellent for dramatic flair, not so much for a sudden rain shower. Outside of nobility, most women adhered to simpler veils, practical linen caps, or modest circlets. Simpler, significantly less dangerous, and far less likely to be mistaken for a siege weapon. Clergy and conservative thinkers, as one might expect, were less than enthusiastic about these trends. They warned that such ostentation invited vanity, sin, and quite possibly severe neck strain. Still, hennins remained immensely popular among those who could afford them, much like most terrible but undeniably fashionable ideas throughout history. And while men didn't wear towering cones, they certainly had their own distinct style statements. Think feathered caps, luxurious fur-trimmed hoods, and remarkably pointy shoes that could easily double as fencing equipment. In medieval times, a woman's ideal body was not meant to be athletic, overtly curvy, or toned. No, the ultimate goal was to appear delicate, demure, and perhaps subtly recovering from a recent fainting spell. The ideal figure was slim, soft, and slightly ethereal, akin to someone who subsisted primarily on honey water, the elegant words of courtly poems, and perhaps one fig per week. Beauty manuals of the era certainly didn't advise women to build strength or endurance. The only lifting expected of you was the graceful lifting of your veil in a flirtatious gesture before swiftly looking away and perhaps gently swooning. However, this wasn't about appearing overtly sickly, at least not obviously so. The sweet spot was somewhere between being too weak to carry a bucket and still being perfectly capable of playing the lute while seated. A graceful, willowy figure was strongly associated with nobility, because, of course, if you were engaged in manual labor, you would naturally possess broader shoulders, stronger arms, and the unfortunate consequence of visible muscle tone. The emphasis was on a narrow waist, subtly soft curves, and a general air of spiritual exhaustion. Waistlines on dresses were often cinched just below the bust, an early version of the empire waist, to elongate the torso and create the illusion of both height and fragility. And if that illusion required a little assistance, tight lacing was readily available. Not quite corsets, which arrived later, but tightly bound kirtles and girdles served the purpose perfectly well. Being too thin, however, was also not the objective. In times of famine or plague, being extremely thin was a significant red flag, indicating that the person might be actively dying. A small hint of roundness, particularly in the face or hips, was considered both healthy and indicative of fertility. Basically, if you looked as though you could comfortably survive winter and still compose poetic verses, you were in the ideal range. Diet advice from the period was not exactly balanced. Beauty manuals recommended things like eating fennel for digestion, rose petals for fresh breath, and drinking wine to improve one's complexion. Protein was only suggested if it still had a feather attached. Men, on the other hand, were permitted to have more physical substance. Broad shoulders, strong legs, and the evident ability to carry a sword without toppling over. But even for men, nobility generally preferred a lean frame with refined posture, not overt brute strength. In the Middle Ages, a woman's eyes were her silent power. They were the medieval equivalent of sending a subtly flirty emoji, just with more spiritual implications and slightly less blinking. The ideal medieval eyes were large, clear, and soulful, the kind that seemed to whisper, "I'm full of virtue," and perhaps just a hint of melancholy. Think of eyes that appeared as if they had personally witnessed the fall of man and were still politely recovering. Poets of the period couldn't get enough of them. They described eyes as luminous orbs, dewdrops of heaven, or pools of pure devotion. What they rarely, if ever, mentioned was bloodshot, allergy-ridden, or "I was up all night churning butter." Light-colored eyes, particularly blue or gray, were often idealized in Northern Europe, associated with innocence, purity, and the general assumption that you hadn't witnessed too many disturbing things, or at least pretended not to. In Southern Europe, darker eyes were also admired, especially if they came paired with noble lineage and a good dowry. Enhancing the eyes was challenging. There were no medieval eyeliner pens, just charcoal soot and a generous dose of optimism. Some women dabbed a little black powder around their lashes to make their eyes appear larger, risking irritation, blurry vision, or inadvertently creating the world's first accidental smoky eye. but most women relied on nature and strategic lighting. Want to appear more wide-eyed? Stand near a candle. Want to look virtuous? Gaze downward at all times, even if it meant tripping over the cat. Interestingly, slightly teary eyes were often admired. This suggested emotional sensitivity, piety, and perhaps that you had just finished praying or reading something uplifting, like a 300-line poem about chastity. Artificial tears weren't available, but staring directly into smoke or enduring mild public humiliation usually did the trick. As for eye contact, it was a delicate dance. Too much could be seen as bold, flirtatious, or suspiciously French. Too little, and you risk seeming shifty, or worse, possessed. The trick was to occasionally glance up from beneath lowered lids, like someone who had memorized the Bible but wasn't about to openly brag about it. Let's discuss something rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry: breath. Specifically, what it smelled like. While a knight might wax lyrical about his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-like teeth, he usually discreetly omitted what transpired when those lips happened to open. This is because medieval dental hygiene was at best an aspirational concept, and minty freshness hadn't been invented yet. Unless, of course, you count standing near a herb garden and simply hoping for the best. Still, fresh breath was technically considered desirable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth subtly hinted at youth, good health, and the convenient fact that you probably hadn't consumed garlic and eels for breakfast, though statistically speaking, you probably had. Medieval women did what they could to mitigate this. They chewed parsley, fennel seeds, cloves, cinnamon sticks, and occasionally even twigs. These weren't just for taste. They were chewed specifically to keep the mouth tolerable. Think of it as the pre-mint version of chewing gum. It didn't sparkle your teeth, but it made you marginally more kissable, or at the very least, less terrifying in close conversation. For those with access to apothecaries, there were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses crafted from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were applied sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit much. Toothbrushing, as we know it today, was not standard practice. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloths, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or utilized chew sticks, small fibrous twigs that could scrub and also serve as something to fidget with while your suitor recited bad poetry. And while halitosis wasn't exactly romantic, it wasn't considered particularly shocking either. After all, everyone suffered from bad breath to some degree, and they all had far more pressing concerns, such as surviving winter or avoiding being accused and burned as a heretic. For noble women, the primary objective was to minimize offense while maintaining an air of grace. Conversations typically took place at a respectable arm's length. Public displays of affection were limited. And when in doubt, the strategy was to fan yourself gently and adopt a contemplative expression. Bonus points if you carried a small pomander, a scented orb filled with fragrant herbs, to discreetly wave in your own direction as needed. In modern times, a dazzling smile can launch 1,000 dating apps. In the Middle Ages, however, a smile was a risky endeavor, best used sparingly, much like exotic spices or unexpected peasant revolts. Why? Well, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly flourishing. Teeth were undeniably important, yes, but primarily for the practical purpose of chewing bread rather than for charming potential suitors. Most people possessed teeth that ranged from slightly questionable to actively terrifying, especially by the age of 30. So the fewer people saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely due to negligence. Tooth decay was rampant, largely thanks to diets heavy in bread, porridge, and mead, and a complete lack of toothbrushes, dental floss, or literally any kind of fluoride. Sugar wasn't yet widely consumed in most of Europe, but even basic starches broke down into tooth-tarnishing misery. Furthermore, dental surgery at the time was essentially an exorcism performed with pliers. Despite these challenges, a healthy smile was quietly admired, though certainly not loudly celebrated. White, evenly spaced teeth were rare and seen as a mark of youth, good fortune, and perhaps even a minor miracle. But people were not walking around flashing big, toothy grins like medieval toothpaste commercials. In fact, a demure, closed-lip smile was considered far more fashionable. Think, I might be contemplating a sonnet rather than I'm thrilled to be here. Some women even used powders made of sage, salt, or ground-up coral to attempt to clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were mildly effective and mostly abrasive. Imagine brushing your teeth with sand and simply hoping for the best. But overall, teeth were tolerated, not flaunted. Medieval art, for instance, almost never depicts open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels typically kept their mouths politely closed, as if they too were quietly aware of the inherent risks of showing too much. Men were not immune to these dental realities either. A knight might indeed win the heart of a lady with his bravery and chiseled jawline, but no romantic ballad ever included the line, "His pearly whites gleamed like ivory." There's a very good reason why troubadours sang about eyes, hair, and hands, not breath and bite alignment. When it came to medieval beauty standards for men, the expectations were surprisingly specific. You weren't required to be chiseled like a Greek statue, but you also couldn't appear as though you had just fallen off a hay cart. The ideal balance was somewhere between being ready to joust and being capable of writing a compelling poem about jousting without actually engaging in it. The ideal man was tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and very importantly, nobly unbothered. Not overly muscular, that suggested manual labor, but certainly not soft either, as that suggested laziness or an excessive fondness for mead. You wanted to project the image that you could effortlessly swing a sword, but only if your squire was conveniently busy. A defined jawline, prominent cheekbones, and a straight nose were all considered attractive. Think prince in an illuminated manuscript, rather than village strongman. A well-groomed beard or a smoothly clean-shaven face was acceptable, depending on the specific region and era. But either way, it needed to look intentional, not as if you had been lost in the woods for a week. Hair was typically shoulder-length and meticulously styled, especially for noblemen. Curls were in fashion in many courts, particularly if they occurred naturally or appeared to. Some men even used curling irons. Yes, really. Small heated rods or herbal rinses were employed to enhance texture and shine. Because nothing quite says, "I am above manual labor," like sitting for 45 minutes while your page boy meticulously styles your fringe. Clothing played an enormous role in enhancing the male silhouette. Padded shoulders, cinched waists, and fitted tunics all helped to create the ideal body shape, with extra emphasis placed on impeccable posture. A nobleman did not slouch. He glided, often with a subtle hint of disdain. And if a man happened to be naturally muscular, that was perfectly acceptable, as long as he wasn't actually caught engaging in manual labor with those muscles. Fighting in wars was permissible. Hauling barrels was not. Above all, the desired look was one of effortless appeal. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive, you were simply born noble. And that inherent nobility alone made you appealing, a kind of medieval version of being hot without trying, except instead of a gym membership, you inherited land and a falcon. In an era where bathing was technically optional and plumbing remained mostly a dream with a Latin name, scent management evolved into a complex art form. And not the glamorous, walk through a cloud of Chanel No. 5 kind of art, but rather the mask and pray variety. To be fair, people did bathe, just not as frequently as we might hope, especially depending on the specific century, geographical location, and frequency of plague outbreaks. So, to avoid offending nostrils, both human and presumably divine, medieval men and women turned to the olfactive power of herbs, oils, and perfumed pouches. Let's begin with the pomander. This was a small, hollow ball, typically crafted from metal, worn on a chain or pinned to clothing, and filled with strongly scented herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and occasionally something ominously labeled powder of roses. These weren't merely for elegance, they were essentially portable smell shields. Think of them as the medieval version of walking around with a discreet air freshener. The nobility also favored perfumed gloves, handkerchiefs, and even scented combs. Everything was considered fair game for aroma enhancement, including hair, which was sometimes doused with floral waters or vinegar infusions that smelled marginally better than sweat and desperation. Speaking of sweat, yes, people absolutely perspired. Medieval garments were heavy, summers were hot, and effective deodorant was still several centuries away from reinventing armpits. The solution? layers of linen, which absorbed sweat and could be washed more frequently than the heavier woolen or silk outer garments. Some individuals added herbal sachets to their underlayers, hoping to combat odor with fragrant optimism. Bathhouses were a feature, particularly during the early medieval and late medieval periods, but access varied wildly. The church eventually began to frown upon communal nudity, which undeniably put a damper on widespread hygiene enthusiasm. So many individuals resorted to dry bathing, which is exactly as unrefreshing as it sounds, wiping oneself with a cloth, then spritzing on scented water, and simply pretending that counted as cleanliness. And then there were the overachievers, people who meticulously kept flower petals in their shoes or thoughtfully stuffed herbs into their bed linens to smell vaguely like someone who had recently visited a garden. In medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just skin deep. It was profoundly morally loaded. A well-composed face could be interpreted as a divine blessing, a potent social weapon, or a cunning trap set by the devil himself, sometimes all three before breakfast. To be considered beautiful was to walk a very fine line. On one hand, physical beauty, clear skin, symmetrical features, a pale complexion, was often seen as a sign of virtue. If you were lovely, it implied you were blessed, possibly chosen by God, or at the very least, unlikely to steal sheep. Poets, preachers, and painters alike described beauty as tangible evidence of a pure soul. But there was a significant catch. If you knew you were beautiful, or worse, if you actively used that beauty to your advantage, you immediately became suspect. Vanity was a sin, remember, and showing too much interest in one's own appearance subtly hinted at pride, seduction, or worst of all, French tendencies. Medieval sermons frequently warned that women's beauty could tempt men into sin, which, of course, was entirely the woman's fault. Eve set a clear precedent, and medieval Europe ran with it for a solid 1,000 years. A woman wearing makeup, allowing a bit of hair to show, or fluttering her lashes at the wrong night could easily find herself accused of being everything from immoral to outright demonic. Some even believed that beauty itself could be an illusion, a sorceress's disguise, a powerful glamour conjured by witches to lead righteous men astray. This may sound dramatic, but remember, this was a time when even bad weather could potentially get you burned at the stake. Conversely, those who were plain or ill-featured were sometimes assumed to be morally deficient or simply unfortunate. The idea that outward appearance directly reflected inner character wasn't just popular, it was often doctrine in certain circles. Beauty implied grace, ugliness implied punishment, illness, or divine disappointment. Of course, all of this made things spectacularly confusing. Be beautiful, but don't try too hard. Glow with virtue, but not so much that it looks like pride. And above all, never look more attractive than the local lord's wife. That was a one-way ticket to a silent convent or an unusually convenient illness. So in the end, medieval beauty standards weren't merely about aesthetics. They were a full-blown moral tightrope, meticulously balancing vanity, virtue, and whatever powdered lead was left in your makeup kit. Music fades out completely. New, perhaps slightly more dramatic, but still calm music begins. The Persian immortals were far more than just elite troops. They were a profound statement, a living symbol of imperial strength, meticulous precision, and unyielding continuity. Their origins can be traced back to the very birth of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BCE. At a time when Persia was rapidly transforming from a regional power into a sprawling imperial juggernaut, Cyrus instinctively understood something vital. An empire requires a steadfast backbone, not just capable administrators and governors, but an elite force capable of projecting dominance, inspiring unwavering loyalty, and suppressing rebellion with equal efficiency. Thus, the Immortals were born. The name Immortals wasn't merely a flourish of royal flair, it was a masterful logistical and psychological stroke. According to Herodotus, their strength was always meticulously maintained at precisely 10,000 men. If one man died, fell ill, or was wounded, he was instantly replaced. Their numbers never wavered. From an external perspective, it appeared as though they could not be diminished, could not be weakened, and above all, could not die. Whether this was strict adherence to fact or clever bookkeeping, the powerful image certainly stuck, and the name endured. Immortality, in this specific context, wasn't about individual survival. It was about the eternal, unwavering presence of Persian might. These men were not random conscripts. To become an immortal meant being meticulously selected from among the Persian nobility, or at the very least from families of high status and proven loyalty. Training began at a young age, and discipline was notoriously brutal. Loyalty to the king was utterly unquestionable. They were expected to be not just formidable warriors, but exemplars of Achaemenid values: order, absolute obedience, and unwavering composure under immense pressure. They were also richly dressed, adorned in robes of fine materials, with subtle scale armor beneath their outer garments, and typically armed with a spear, a bow, a short sword, and a sturdy wicker shield. Their appearance was as carefully calculated as their military tactics. Persian kings were not simply sending warriors into battle, they were dispatching a mobile political message, elegantly wrapped in silk and steel. From the plains of Lydia to the deserts of Egypt, wherever the Persian Empire expanded, the immortals closely followed. They stood steadfastly behind kings, proudly beside thrones, and fearlessly at the very front of the battlefield. If you saw them approaching, you didn't just see soldiers, you beheld the unbroken heartbeat of the empire. Immortals didn't blink. Immortals didn't retreat. Immortals simply endured. And that, precisely, is what made them so terrifying. The appearance of the Persian immortals was no mere coincidence. It was, in fact, a sophisticated form of psychological warfare. These men were not covered from head to toe in gleaming bronze, like the Greek hoplites. No, the immortals possessed an otherworldly appearance, like a serene wave of richly dressed shadows sweeping gracefully across the land. Their uniforms masterfully blended regal flair with essential military function. They wore elaborately embroidered tunics and trousers, often dyed in rich reds and purples, colors traditionally associated with nobility and command. Beneath these outer layers lay a protective layer of scale armor, crafted from bronze or iron, flexible enough for swift movement, yet deadly in close combat. Their shields were made from woven wicker, deceptively light yet remarkably capable of deflecting arrows and absorbing powerful blows. Their most distinctive element, however, was their headdress, a soft felt cap known as a tiara, sometimes deliberately pulled over the face to obscure individual identity. Unlike the Greeks, who glorified individuality in armor and valor, the immortals thrived in perfect uniformity. 10,000 men moving in near-perfect silence, all similarly armed and armored, created a visual spectacle that overwhelmed the senses. It was akin to watching a precise curtain of death descend upon the battlefield. Each immortal carried a short spear, a bow with a quiver of arrows, and a short sword or a dagger on their belt. But perhaps most impressive was their innate ability to move quickly and remain lethally effective in almost any terrain. Their rigorous training emphasized agility and endurance over brute strength. They could march across entire provinces without ever breaking formation. And unlike many other ancient forces, the immortals were equally adept at fighting in open battle or serving as formidable imperial guards in royal courts. Their equipment was light enough to ensure swift deployment, yet potent enough to both intimidate and destroy. It wasn't about raw brute force, it was about unwavering consistency, about never failing, never staggering, and never appearing vulnerable. And that consistency, combined with the subtle mystery of their appearance, was instrumental in forging their enduring legend. When they marched into battle, drums would pound rhythmically and dust would rise behind them, but their expressions remained eerily composed. There was no roaring, no boasting, just an unsettling, synchronized precision. It was as though they were not men, but rather machines, crafted not of flesh, but of sheer discipline, ritual, and instilled fear. To face the immortals was not simply to face death, it was to confront a concept that some armies didn't just fight, they endured, without pause or pity. To be an immortal was not merely a job, it was a lifelong identity, a significant status symbol, and in some ways a predefined sentence. While they were revered and richly rewarded, the expectations placed upon them were immense. These men lived under constant scrutiny. Their food, clothing, and housing were all meticulously provided by the state, but not out of mere kindness. It was to ensure absolute control. From the very moment they entered the ranks, they belonged not to their families, but entirely to the empire. Most immortals originated from Persian, Median, or Elamite nobility, but lower-ranking sons of loyal families could also rise into the ranks if they demonstrated exceptional discipline. Training began in childhood, often within military academies directly attached to the royal court. Boys learned archery while on horseback, how to endure pain and hunger, how to march in perfect step, and most importantly, how to obey without any hesitation. There was no room for personal glory-seeking or individual ambition. An immortal who stood out too much was swiftly corrected. The formation was considered sacred, unity superseded all else. Discipline governed every aspect of their lives. They adhered to a strict daily routine, waking before dawn, drilling in silence, meticulously maintaining weapons and armor. Meals were eaten communally, always modest, and always nutritionally calculated for sustained endurance. Meat, flatbread, dates, and wine were staples, but luxuries were actively discouraged. The empire required formidable warriors, not pampered aristocrats. When not on campaign, the immortals served as guards for the king and his court. But even then, their duties extended beyond mere ceremony. They stood vigilant against assassination attempts, discreetly monitored nobles for any signs of disloyalty, and maintained order in the most volatile places of the empire. Their very presence alone could quell dissent in a royal hall. They functioned as the eyes and ears of the Achaemenid ruler, trained to detect lies, sense fear, and act decisively. Interestingly, they weren't entirely cut off from family life. Immortals were permitted to marry and maintain households. However, they could be summoned for duty at a moment's notice. When duty called, they left everything behind, no questions asked. A man who hesitated even once could be quietly replaced. After all, the number always had to remain at 10,000. No gaps, no delays. It was this cold, efficient system that solidified their mythos. They didn't just fight with discipline, they lived within discipline. They were honed tools of the empire, polished and sharpened until nothing remained but their unwavering duty. If Cyrus the Great established the immortals, it was Darius the Great who meticulously perfected them. When Darius ascended to power in 522 BCE amidst a backdrop of palace intrigue and assassination, the immortals served as the crucial instrument he used to legitimize and stabilize his reign. They were no longer merely a personal guard. They became a direct extension of royal authority, seamlessly woven into the very fabric of his expanding imperial bureaucracy. Darius keenly understood that power did not solely rest on military strength, but equally on the powerful illusion of order and inevitability. And nothing projected that image more effectively than the immortals. He paraded them at grand festivals, had them prominently stationed around his new capital of Persepolis, and dispatched them on highly visible, high-profile missions. They were always visible, always composed, always the same 10,000 eternal faces of Persian dominance. But Darius also strategically reshaped their tactical role. Under his astute leadership, the immortals became a core element of Persian combined arms warfare. No longer simply elite infantry, they were frequently deployed alongside archers, cavalry, and chariotry in meticulously coordinated strikes. Darius placed immense value on strategic flexibility, and the immortals were compelled to adapt. They trained more rigorously in ranged combat, siege warfare, and complex battlefield coordination. Reports from later Greek observers describe how they moved with terrifying efficiency, firing volleys of arrows while steadily advancing behind their wicker shields, never once breaking formation. They also became heavily involved in suppressing numerous rebellions. Darius's vast empire stretched from Egypt to the Indus Valley, and revolts were a frequent occurrence. The immortals were often the very first wave of retaliation in regions like Elam, Babylon, and Scythia. They acted as both punishment and a clear message. The empire is watching, and the king's will is inexhaustible. It was under Darius that they earned a darker reputation, not just elite warriors, but formidable instruments of fear and retribution. Even their iconography was elevated. Carvings at Persepolis depict them in perfect, stylized, and identical lines, facing eternity in stone. These were not mere portraits, they were powerful propaganda. Darius desired every subject and visitor to understand, these men are always here, always armed, and they do not die. Step out of line, and you'll meet 1 or 10,000. Through Darius, the immortals transcended their role as a mere military unit. They were institutionalized fear, intricately woven into the royal image, deployed with surgical precision and enveloped in a gold-threaded silence. The Persian immortals reached the very height of their legend during the reign of Xerxes the Great, and nowhere was their formidable reputation more fiercely tested than at the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. This battle, now profoundly mythologized through centuries of art and cinema, wasn't merely a clash of opposing armies. It was a symbolic collision between two radically different worldviews: Persian imperial order versus Greek city-state defiance. And at the very center of that historical storm stood the immortals. When Xerxes invaded Greece with what ancient sources claimed was the largest army the world had ever seen, he brought the immortals as his personal vanguard. They didn't just guard him, they were akin to a scalpel in the very heart of chaos. Their fearsome reputation alone preceded them. The Greeks had heard whispers of the 10,000 who never died, the elite troops who served kings like gods and fought with flawless precision. At Thermopylae, they encountered a resistance that truly rattled their mythos. King Leonidas and his few thousand Greeks, most famously 300 Spartans, bravely held the narrow pass against wave after relentless wave of Persian attacks. On the second day of battle, Xerxes specifically ordered the immortals to break the Greek line. It was intended to be a crushing blow. After all, these were the elite of the elite. But what followed was not the instant rout Xerxes had fully expected. The immortals, skilled as they undoubtedly were, found themselves severely constrained by the tight geography of the pass. Their bows were nearly useless in such confined space, and their shorter spears couldn't reach past the formidable long dory spears of the Greek hoplites. For hours they clashed with the highly disciplined Spartans, who fought in tight, interlocking phalanxes, having been trained from childhood for precisely this kind of close-quarters combat. The immortals suffered losses, heavy ones. Herodotus noted, perhaps with some glee, that they were no more successful than the ordinary troops. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a profound rupture in their carefully cultivated image. The immortals had always appeared untouchable, like gods of war in silk and scale. But at Thermopylae, they bled, they died, and for the very first time, the illusion of their immortality cracked under the relentless weight of Spartan spears and defiant Greek resolve. Yet, even in defeat, they remained terrifying. They adapted, they regrouped, and they marched again. Immortality, after all, wasn't about invincibility, it was about unwavering endurance. The most fascinating aspect of the Persian immortals wasn't merely their rigorous training or their effective battlefield tactics, it was their ingenious system. What truly rendered them immortal wasn't magic or divine favor, it was meticulous administration, a cold, efficient, and relentless bureaucracy. When one immortal fell, whether in battle, due to illness, or upon retirement, another instantly took his place. There was no mourning period, no elaborate ceremony, just a seamless, immediate substitution. The total number always remained precisely 10,000. This wasn't a poetic exaggeration, it was a deliberate design. The Achaemenid Empire functioned on precise logistics, and the immortals served as the prime example. They maintained a constantly ready pool of trainees and understudies, young men meticulously groomed to fill vacancies the very moment they appeared. These replacements were kept in the capital, supervised, rigorously drilled, and rotated through lesser duties until they were called up. This internal structure made the immortals far more than a static elite unit. They were a living system of excellence, constantly regenerating, perpetually evolving. To facilitate this seamless process, records were kept with meticulous care. Officers known as hazardous, literally commander of 1,000, oversaw recruitment, discipline, and supply. There were 10 such commanders beneath the overall leader of the immortals. Below them, an intricate web of sub-commanders, scribes, and quartermasters ensured that every man had the correct arms, rations, lodging, and medical support. Lose a man in Egypt, and a replacement was promptly dispatched from Susa. A soldier breaks a leg during patrol in Media, his successor was already packing his gear. This sophisticated machinery extended beyond mere military readiness. It was profoundly psychological. The illusion of 10,000 unchanging warriors served as a powerful tool of imperial terror. If you managed to kill one, another immediately stepped into his place. It didn't matter who they were individually, their personal identity was irrelevant. their unwavering presence was eternal. Like a hydra of discipline and silk, the immortals created the powerful illusion of an unstoppable force, because the machine never paused to grieve. Even off the battlefield, this system functioned flawlessly. If an immortal's family became disloyal or politically compromised, he was quietly removed and replaced. No scandal, no drama. The line simply moved forward as if nothing had changed. This mechanism, so alien when compared to the glory-seeking Greek ethos, was perhaps the immortals' greatest strength. Not individual skill, not fleeting courage, but the cold, undeniable certainty that they could never truly disappear. While the Persian immortals are primarily remembered as formidable warriors, they also served a far subtler role: diplomats in armor. In the Achaemenid worldview, military force wasn't solely about conquest, it was equally about presence. And the immortals were frequently deployed not just to engage in combat, but to be seen, to enter foreign courts as living, breathing representations of Persian elegance and power. Their silken robes, gilded weapons, and impeccable discipline made them terrifying in battle, but mesmerizing in peaceful settings. When ambassadors arrived in foreign lands, the immortals often accompanied them, not primarily for protection, but as a spectacle. Imagine a small elite escort entering a Greek or Babylonian city. 10 men, perfectly synchronized, dressed not in rough leather or blood-stained bronze, but in fine tunics laced with gold, silent and unreadable behind their soft felt headdresses. They didn't shout or threaten. They didn't need to. Their very existence was a form of negotiation. In satrapies, provinces, immortals were regularly stationed to subtly remind local governors where true power ultimately resided. They rarely interfered directly with civil rule, but they were always present, always watching. A mere whisper of sedition could bring a squad of them directly to a governor's door. Rebellion in the provinces was often stifled before it even began, simply because the alternative, facing the immortals, was deemed too dreadful to even contemplate. Even within the royal court, their presence served multiple functions. They acted as ceremonial guards during Nowruz festivals, coronations, and diplomatic receptions. But behind the scenes, they diligently monitored courtiers, subtly sniffed out treason, and enforced the king's will with silent efficiency. Some historians argue they functioned almost like an internal intelligence agency, an ever-present warning that loyalty was not optional. This dual identity, warrior and envoy, enforcer and ornament, was a crucial part of their genius. Unlike most elite units of ancient times, who lived solely for the glory of battle, the immortals served a much broader imperial strategy. Warfare was merely one tool. Their empire was held together not just by swords, but by powerful symbols. The immortals understood that fear and awe are inherently intertwined. In foreign courts and remote palaces, their arrival conveyed a clear, unmistakable message. The king is watching, the empire is eternal, and resistance is not worth the cost. And in this powerful way, they often fought wars without ever unsheathing a blade. All empires eventually age, and so too do their legends. By the later years of the Achaemenid Empire, the immortals were still feared, still widely respected, but no longer truly invincible. The very machinery that had once made them immortal began to slowly rust, not with a dramatic, sudden collapse, but with a gradual, creeping inefficiency. As Persian kings became increasingly detached from the battlefield, more preoccupied with courtly luxury and intricate intrigues, the immortals too began to subtly shift. They transformed from hardened warriors into more ceremonial royal ornaments under kings like Artaxerxes and Darius III. The elite guard still existed, still dressed the part, still marched in perfect formation, but crucial cracks had begun to form. Recruitment standards slipped, and political favoritism began to seep into their once pristine ranks. Where once only the most disciplined and fiercely loyal men were selected, now nobles pulled strings to place unworthy sons into the sacred 10,000. The result was subtle but ultimately fatal. Uniformity without genuine spirit, discipline without true heart. This internal decay became tragically obvious when Alexander the Great launched his invasion of Persia in 334 BCE. At the decisive Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, the immortals were deployed alongside the Persian center to defend Darius III. And although they fought with commendable courage, they could not withstand the tactical brilliance and ruthless momentum of Alexander's Macedonian phalanx. They were outflanked, outmaneuvered, and ultimately overwhelmed. Worse yet, their powerful myth did not survive the battle. For centuries, the name Immortals had inspired profound awe. But Gaugamela undeniably proved they were no longer what they had been under Cyrus the Great or Xerxes the First. The machinery of instant replacement faltered. The backup system that once rendered their losses invisible simply wasn't in place anymore. The unit never truly recovered. When Alexander marched into Persepolis and seized the royal palace, he entered a mere shell of an empire. The Immortals were not there to defend it. The unbroken line had, at long last, been broken. But their story did not completely end with this defeat. Elements of the Immortals lived on. Alexander subtly co-opted Persian traditions into his own army. Later, in the Sasanian Empire, a new elite force would rise, sometimes even being referred to as Immortals again by historians. Though not direct descendants, they powerfully echoed the original myth. 10,000 strong, elite, fearsome, and eternal. Even in their fall, the Immortals left a lasting blueprint. They had demonstrated to the world how to construct not just a formidable army, but an enduring legend. The Persian Immortals may have vanished from the battlefield, but their profound influence never truly disappeared. Long after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire, the powerful idea of an unbreakable, elite fighting force remained firmly lodged in the imagination of generals, kings, and storytellers alike. Their legend endured, not because they won every battle, but because they represented something far larger, the very perfection of state-controlled power, an army that did not age, did not question, and did not falter. When the Greeks described them, it was with a curious mix of awe and suspicion. Herodotus famously called them immortals, not because they could not be killed, but because they could not be seen to die. Their replacements were immediate, their presence was eternal. To the Greeks, this was eerie, almost unnatural. They were accustomed to warfare as a chaotic, intensely personal affair. The Immortals were something else entirely. Precise, faceless, disciplined to the very edge of humanity. In Roman times, scholars still reference the Immortals when discussing ancient military power. Even Byzantine historians noted the remarkable structure of the Persian elite guard as something to be admired. And in the early Islamic period, Arab historians recounted tales of the 10,000 who had once guarded kings of old, their spears glinting like a forest of silver under the desert sun. The core concept would be revived again in the Sasanian Empire, where an elite cavalry corps, sometimes referred to by historians as the New Immortals, served as the empire's armored fist. Though not directly descended from the Achaemenid unit, they carried the same mission, embodying imperial invincibility. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, centuries later, meticulously studied Persian military organization and praised their precise structure. Culturally, the Immortals subtly seeped into myth. Modern media often misrepresents them, transforming them into monsters, demons, or masked assassins. But the truth was far more compelling. They were human, terrifyingly human. Ordinary men transformed into formidable instruments of empire through relentless training, sophisticated psychological control, and a deeply embedded system of continuity. They didn't require magic to become legendary, just consistency and a profound silence. Their greatest weapon wasn't their sword, it was the powerful idea that they were always coming, an eternal shadow on the horizon. And so, the Immortals continue to live on, in stone carvings, in battle doctrines, and in the whispered fears of those who understand that power, when meticulously organized and endlessly replaced, can become something very close to true immortality. Music fades out completely. New soft ambient music. Narrator. Before there were legends of Greek Amazons, there were the Scythians. These nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe were both feared and respected from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. Unlike most ancient societies, Scythian women didn't remain behind the tents, weaving cloth or simply raising children. They rode horses, skillfully wielded bows, and bravely went to war. And they didn't just accompany men into battle, they led and fought with lethal skill. These were not mere exceptions. This was deeply embedded in their culture. Greek historians like Herodotus were astonished when they encountered these remarkable women. He vividly described entire tribes where women adamantly refused to marry unless they had first killed an enemy in combat. His words, originally intended as exotic curiosities, have since found remarkable archaeological proof. Burial mounds, known as kurgans, scattered across Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia, have yielded astonishing finds. The skeletons of young women interred with bows, arrows, swords, and even clear battle-inflicted injuries. One such discovery revealed a woman with an arrowhead lodged in her spine, her body armored, her grave richly furnished. These were not merely ceremonial weapons. They had been used extensively, and so had she. Scythian society was fundamentally different from its contemporaries. Life on the challenging steppe demanded both mobility and immense resilience. Everyone, male or female, had to ride, hunt, and defend the tribe. Girls learned archery at as young an age as boys did. They wore the same practical leather trousers, the same protective armor. They even styled their hair and tattoos in similar fashion, making them virtually indistinguishable on horseback under a storm of arrows. This fostered a warrior culture in which gender roles were remarkably fluid on the battlefield, yet perhaps more distinct off it. A Scythian woman could be lethally effective at a full gallop, and then return home to fulfill traditional ritual and maternal duties. The two roles were not in conflict, they were complementary. Greek myths of the Amazon may very well have been inspired by exaggerated encounters with real Scythian women. But while the Amazons of myth vanished into pure fantasy, the Scythians were undeniably real. They bravely fought Persians, clashed with Greeks, and instilled terror in the Macedonians. And for centuries they roamed the vast steppe with fire and fury, men and women alike. In the small West African kingdom of Dahomey, now modern-day Benin, an army comprised entirely of women once instilled fear into European colonizers, rival kingdoms, and anyone foolish enough to underestimate their formidable power. They were known as the Aguji, but the French notably nicknamed them the Dahomey Amazons, a direct comparison to the Greek myths. But these particular warriors were very, very real. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Aguji had become the standing royal guard of Dahomey's king. But they were far more than mere guards. They were elite infantry, rigorously trained to kill, to defend, and to never, ever retreat. Initially, they may have begun as elephant hunters or palace attendants, but over time they evolved into a formal, highly feared military force. Recruited as young girls, often specifically chosen for their strength or indomitable spirit, the Aguji were separated from their families and placed into intense, brutal training. Discipline was total. They ran obstacle courses filled with thorns, sparred with actual sharpened blades, and swore solemn oaths of celibacy and absolute loyalty to the king. They wore distinctive braided sashes and carried muskets, machetes, and clubs. But their most lethal weapon was undoubtedly psychological. European observers during the 19th century were shocked by their apparent fearlessness and brutality. One French officer noted with palpable unease how a Dahomey Amazon rushed forward, brutally ripped open a man's throat, then calmly wiped her blade clean. These were not symbolic warriors. They were frontline shock troops, frequently deployed in raids, pitched battles, and ambushes. During the Franco-Dahomeyan Wars in the 1890s, the Aguji went toe-to-toe with seasoned French colonial troops. Outnumbered and outgunned, they still launched daring night raids, executed precise ambushes, and fought street by street to defend their kingdom. Their sheer tenacity forced French commanders to seriously reconsider their tactics and their preconceived assumptions about gender in combat. But it wasn't solely their battlefield success that mattered. The Dahomey Amazons existed in a deeply patriarchal world, and yet they meticulously carved out a unique space of total autonomy and profound influence. They advised kings, performed crucial ceremonial duties, and significantly shaped the kingdom's foreign policy, not from behind the scenes, but with blades firmly in hand. Though the French ultimately defeated Dahomey, the legend of the Aguji never died. In fact, their legacy has helped inspire modern fictional warriors, such as the Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther. But truth, as always, is far more impressive than fiction. In the shadowy pages of Japan's medieval history, one woman rides through both blood and legend alike, Tomoe Gozen, a formidable samurai warrior of the late 12th century. She fought during the Genpei War, a brutal civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans that ultimately gave birth to the first shogunate. Tomoe wasn't a symbolic figure or a passive consort. She was a true commander, a skilled swordswoman, and a masterful archer, rigorously trained in the deadly arts of the battlefield and widely feared for her precision in combat. Her compelling story emerges most famously from the Heike Monogatari, a sprawling war epic that skillfully blends historical events with poetic flair. In it, Tomoe is described as exceptionally beautiful, possessing fair skin, long hair, and charming features. But the very next sentence delivers the real impact. She was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman, she was a warrior worth 1,000. Beauty and lethality were not contradictions, they were perfectly fused within her. Tomoe served under Minamoto no Yoshinaka, a warlord and her possible lover, during his campaign to seize control of Kyoto. She wasn't a mere camp follower or a battlefield nurse. She was directly in the thick of the action, reportedly leading troops and even personally slaying multiple enemies in single combat. At the Battle of Awazu in 1184, facing encirclement by rival Minamoto forces, Yoshinaka ordered his desperate last stand. Rather than fleeing, Tomoe chose to fight. In one of her most famous encounters, she is said to have dismounted a charging enemy horseman, wrestled him to the ground, and beheaded him on the spot. She then calmly remounted and continued into the chaos. That moment, possibly embellished but quite possibly true, has endured for centuries as a powerful symbol of her unmatched composure and skill. But what ultimately happened to Tomoe after the war remains shrouded in mystery. Some accounts claim she was captured and forced into marriage. Others say she became a nun, retreating into a life of silence. Still others believe she simply vanished like a ghost back into the mists of legend. Whatever the truth, the powerful legacy of Tomoe Gozen survived in theater, folklore, and national memory. In a society fundamentally built on rigid gender roles and patriarchal control, Tomoe Gozen stood strikingly apart, her blade drawn, head held high, and utterly unafraid. She wasn't just fighting for her lord, she was fighting for her right to exist in a world that explicitly told her she shouldn't. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at its peak, disciplined, highly organized, and seemingly unstoppable. But then came Boudica, a flame-haired Celtic queen from Britannia who very nearly brought the formidable Roman machine to its knees. Her name would powerfully echo through history as a symbol of raw vengeance, fierce national pride, and the terrifying force of a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose. Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England. He was a client king under Roman rule, a puppet ruler permitted to maintain power as long as he kept the peace. But when Prasutagus died, Rome brazenly ignored his will and moved to seize his lands outright. In the process, Roman officials publicly flogged Boudica and, according to the historian Tacitus, raped her daughters. It was a brutal, humiliating act, specifically designed to crush any nascent rebellion. Instead, it ignited a wildfire. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudica successfully united several British tribes and launched one of the most ferocious revolts in all of Roman history. And she was no mere figurehead. Roman accounts describe her personally leading her army from a chariot, spear in hand, dressed in a flowing tunic and a massive gold torque around her neck. Her fiery red hair streamed behind her as she rode, passionately calling her people to war. She was part priestess, part general, and all fury. Her combined forces descended on Camulodunum, modern Colchester, burning it completely to the ground. Next came Londinium, the nascent seed of modern London, where she ruthlessly slaughtered Roman colonists and utterly razed the city. Historians estimate over 70,000 Romans and their sympathizers were killed in just a few short months. Her army left behind a devastating trail of ash and shattered arrogance. But the Romans, under Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, regrouped. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they skillfully lured Boudica into a pitched battle where Roman discipline and their superior formation tactics proved decisive. The rebellion was ultimately crushed. Boudica, facing inevitable defeat, is said to have taken poison rather than endure capture. Though her uprising ultimately failed, Boudica's legacy only grew. Roman historians, while depicting her as a barbarian, grudgingly acknowledged her courage and leadership as impossible to ignore. For the British, especially in later centuries, she became a powerful symbol of resistance against tyranny, both foreign and domestic. In the war-ravaged steppes of Central Asia, during the golden age of Mongol expansion, there emerged a woman who struck fear into seasoned warriors and embarrassed proud princes, not with a sword, but with sheer, undeniable physical dominance. Her name was Kutulun, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of none other than Genghis Khan himself. But she didn't merely ride in his formidable shadow. She meticulously carved out a legend of her own, one headlock at a time. Born around 1260 CE, Kutulun was the daughter of Kaidu Khan, a powerful cousin of Kublai Khan and a rival claimant to leadership within the Mongol Empire. Kutulun was raised much like a warrior prince, rigorously trained in archery, expert horse riding, and fierce battlefield tactics. But she stood out most for her extraordinary talent in wrestling, a deeply respected and highly competitive sport among the Mongols. According to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, Kutulun famously vowed she would only marry a man who could defeat her in a wrestling match. Many suitors attempted, and all of them failed. Dozens of suitors walked away defeated and utterly humiliated, some even wagering horses, gold, or entire herds on their chances. It is said she amassed an astonishing 10,000 horses from her victories, transforming her into not just a champion, but one of the wealthiest women on the steppe. But Kutulun wasn't simply tossing men onto the dirt for sport. She fought bravely alongside her father in real battles, commanding troops and breaking enemy lines. During campaigns against both rival Mongol factions and Chinese forces, Kutulun was Kaidu's most trusted military advisor. He even seriously considered naming her as his successor, an unprecedented move in a culture so heavily dominated by male warlords. This unsurprisingly sparked considerable backlash among some Mongol nobles, who whispered that her influence was unnatural and her power far too threatening. In the end, Kaidu did not make her his direct heir, choosing a male relative instead. But her formidable reputation endured. Even Marco Polo, who traveled extensively through the Mongol Empire, wrote of a Mongol princess who fought like a tiger and could ride and shoot as well as any man. Later histories attempted to romanticize or minimize her, turning her into a love-struck figure or reducing her story to mere legend. But make no mistake, Kutulun was real, and her strength was truly legendary. She powerfully demonstrated that in the very heart of the most male-dominated empire on Earth, a woman could still rise to prominence, not because she was allowed to, but because no one could stop her. In a time when women couldn't vote, freely own land, or even wear men's clothing without risking arrest, one French teenager not only donned armor, she bravely led armies. Joan of Arc, born in 1412 in a tiny village called Domremy, was an illiterate peasant girl. Yet by the age of 17, she would command troops, confront kings, and fundamentally alter the course of the 100 Years' War between France and England. Her meteoric rise was not born from formal military training or noble lineage. Joan claimed divine inspiration. She asserted that she heard voices, those of saints like Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, who explicitly told her that she had been chosen to drive the English from France and crown Charles the Dauphin as king. It was a wild claim, one that should have resulted in her being dismissed as mad. Instead, it miraculously gained her an audience with the future King Charles VII. The court thoroughly tested her, and clergy grilled her for weeks, but somehow she passed. They perceived something in her, undeniable conviction, profound charisma, something utterly unexplainable. And so, clad in white armor, her banner flying high, Joan was sent to Orléans, a besieged city that symbolized the war's critical turning point. French commanders were skeptical, but Joan's mere presence revitalized their spirits. She didn't just stand on the sidelines, she personally led charges, bravely faced arrows, and rallied troops directly under fire. Against all odds, the French successfully lifted the siege. The victory electrified the entire nation. Joan became famously known as the Maid of Orléans, a powerful symbol of divine favor and patriotic resistance. After a string of remarkable victories, she escorted Charles to Rheims, where he was crowned king, precisely as the voices had foretold. But immense power, fame, and miraculous achievements inevitably come with enemies. In 1430, she was tragically captured by Burgundian allies of the English. Tried by a pro-English ecclesiastical court, Joan was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and notably wearing male clothing, a crime punishable by death. She was just 19 years old when they burned her alive in Rouen marketplace. But her death only magnified her legend. Years later, the church formally reversed her conviction, and centuries later, she was canonized as a saint. By the time Nakano Takeko took up her naginata, a bladed polearm traditionally favored by samurai women, Japan was undergoing rapid and dramatic change. It was the late 1860s, and the revered samurai class was being systematically dismantled as the country eagerly modernized. But in one final, defiant stand for the old ways, this young woman would etch her name into history as the last true Onabugeisha, a female warrior of the samurai tradition. Nakano Takeko was born in 1847 into a respected family of scholars and warriors. From a young age, she diligently studied Confucian classics, mastered elegant calligraphy, and most importantly, rigorously trained in martial arts. Her favored weapon, the naginata, was more than just practical. It was deeply symbolic. Traditionally utilized by women of the samurai class, it allowed for extended reach and gracefully fluid combat. Under the guidance of her adoptive father and martial arts master, she trained until her skill rivaled that of the best men in her domain. By her early 20s, Nakano had become both an esteemed educator and a formidable warrior, teaching other women the ways of the sword. But in 1868, when the Boshin War erupted, a brutal civil conflict between the imperial forces and the old Tokugawa shogunate, Nakano did not stay behind. She bravely joined the defense of Aizu, one of the last bastions of traditional samurai resistance. Women were not officially permitted to serve, but Nakano formed an unofficial unit of female fighters known as the Joshigun, or Women's Army. Clad in hakama pants and traditional armor, these women fought fiercely alongside the men, protecting their families, their city, and their cherished way of life. At the Battle of Aizu, Nakano personally led her unit in hand-to-hand combat against imperial troops armed with rifles. According to witnesses, she killed several enemies before being tragically shot in the chest. Knowing she was mortally wounded and unwilling to be captured or defiled, she bravely asked her sister to behead her. Her body was subsequently buried at a temple in Fukushima, her trusted sword placed beside her. Nakano's bravery was legendary, even in defeat. Today, statues of her stand proudly in Japan, particularly in Aizu, where she is remembered not only as a formidable warrior, but as a woman who steadfastly refused to bow to modernity, to patriarchy, or to death itself. In the smoldering ruins of World War II, one name sent shivers down the spines of German soldiers on the Eastern Front: Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Nicknamed Lady Death by her enemies, she wasn't a myth, a mere morale booster, or a propaganda figure. She was the real thing. A Soviet sniper who meticulously tallied 309 confirmed kills, including an astonishing 36 enemy snipers. She stands as the most lethal female sniper in recorded history. Born in 1916 in what is now Ukraine, Pavlichenko was fiercely competitive from a young age. She possessed an intense patriotism and demonstrated a natural aptitude for marksmanship. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she was just 24 years old and diligently studying history at university. But instead of books, she picked up a rifle and courageously volunteered for the Red Army. Officials initially suggested she become a nurse. She adamantly refused. She desired a combat role, and she got one. Deployed to the front lines during the siege of Odessa and later the protracted siege of Sevastopol, Pavlichenko earned her formidable reputation the hard way. She spent long hours motionless, meticulously camouflaged in freezing terrain, patiently waiting for the perfect shot. Her targets weren't just common foot soldiers. She meticulously hunted officers, machine gunners, and rival snipers. She operated with nerves of steel, a patience bordering on supernatural, and an absolute hatred for the invaders. Her kill count climbed so remarkably high that she was eventually pulled from the front and sent on a diplomatic tour of the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. There, she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt and formed a strong friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, who greatly admired her composure and intellect. Pavlichenko delivered powerful speeches, urging the Allies to open a second front in Europe. and openly mocked reporters who asked her sexist questions about makeup and skirt length. After the war, she did not retreat into obscurity. She earned her degree, became a historian, and diligently trained future generations of Soviet snipers. Though she suffered from war-related trauma and injuries, her powerful legacy endured. She received the prestigious Hero of the Soviet Union medal and remains a revered national hero in both Russia and in Ukraine. In a world that often questions the place of women in warfare, Lyudmila Pavlichenko did not argue. She did not protest. She simply performed the job better than almost anyone who ever lived. For every famous name, Boudica, Tomoy Gozin, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, there are countless others whose compelling stories have unfortunately slipped through the cracks of mainstream history. History, after all, was largely written by men. And when women bravely picked up swords, rifles, or spears, their stories were often omitted, downplayed, or transformed into mere myth. But let there be no mistake. Warrior women have been present all along, across continents and across centuries, and their silence was certainly not voluntary. Consider the Trung sisters of Vietnam, Trung Trac and Trung Nhi, who courageously led a rebellion against Chinese occupation in the 1st century CE. They rode elephants into battle, rallied thousands of devoted followers, and successfully ruled an independent state for 3 years before eventually being crushed by superior Chinese forces. Their remarkable resistance is still commemorated today with temples and festivals in their honor, even though global history books rarely mention them. Or Ya Asantewa of the Ashanti Empire in West Africa, who in 1900 led a powerful rebellion against British colonial forces. As Queen Mother, she valiantly rallied her people when the British demanded the sacred golden stool, the ultimate symbol of Ashanti sovereignty. She delivered fiery speeches and personally led her troops in battle, clearly demonstrating that leadership and defiance knew no gender. There were Viking shield maidens, likely not as common as legend suggests, but very much present. Archaeological finds consistently confirm that women were buried with weapons, armor, and even war horses, not as ceremonial tokens, but as actual warriors. There were Apache women fighters in the American Southwest, like Lozin, a spiritual warrior who rode and fought bravely beside her brother, the famous leader Victorio. In every era, in every region, warrior women fought, not always to conquer, but to protect, to defend their families, their cultures, and their homes. Some led entire armies, others fought as lone figures in resistance movements. Some were queens, some were humble peasants, but all of them shattered the persistent lie that warfare belonged exclusively to men. Today, their rich legacy is steadily being reclaimed. From rigorous scholarly research to compelling pop culture representations, the powerful stories of these women are finally resurfacing, and each rediscovered name serves as a poignant reminder. History is not just what was written, it is also what was deliberately erased. These women did not ask to be remembered, they simply asked to be respected. And slowly but surely, the world is beginning to listen. New soft ambient. In the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, music wasn't just mere entertainment. It was profound ritual, immense power, and intricate language. And no instrument embodied this more profoundly than the lyre. Among the world's earliest stringed instruments, the Mesopotamian lyre dates back over 4,500 years, emerging from the Sumerian city of Ur, where music was intimately woven into both sacred temple ceremonies and vibrant royal court life. The lyres of Ur weren't simple harps carved from wood. They were intricate, beautifully crafted objects, often adorned with shimmering gold, gleaming silver, brilliant lapis lazuli, and intricately detailed animal motifs. One of the most famous examples is the bull-headed lyre, astonishingly discovered in a royal tomb in the 1920s by Sir Leonard Woolley. Its soundbox was shaped like a bull's body, and the instrument's head was covered in delicate gold leaf, its beard meticulously crafted from lapis. But this wasn't merely for show. The bull was a potent symbol of strength, and its presence on a lyre may have held deep spiritual significance, not just decorative appeal. Played with the fingers or a small plectrum, the lyre produced a resonant, haunting tone. Though we cannot hear ancient melodies exactly as they were performed, scholars believe the Sumerians utilized a heptatonic scale, 7 notes, much like modern Western music. Clay tablets inscribed with early musical notation provide tantalizing clues, clearly showing that sophisticated music theory and precise scale construction existed even then. These lyres weren't confined to palace halls. In temples, music accompanied offerings and prayers to the gods. Hymns were sung with lyre accompaniment in honor of deities like Inanna and Enlil, thereby transforming music into a sacred bridge between the human and the divine. In funerary rites, lyres mournfully played for the dead, believed to help guide souls into the afterlife. They weren't simply instruments, they were profound voices of transition and transformation. Mesopotamian musicians held a highly respected role in society. Some were female priestesses, others were accomplished court performers. They memorized complex songs passed down orally, often learning from a young age within structured schools for scribes and musicians. Today, replicas of these ancient lyres are played in museums and at reconstructions, their soft, twanging echoes serving as a poignant reminder that long before Mozart, before medieval minstrels, or even Homer's sung epics, humans were plucking strings in the desert, earnestly chasing both beauty and sound. While the lyre sang gently to the gods, the aulos screamed, wept, and danced through the very hearts of the ancient Greeks. This reed-blown, double-piped wind instrument was no gentle flute. It was wild, intensely emotional, and unyielding. To the Greeks, music wasn't just entertainment, it was ethos, a powerful force that profoundly shaped the soul, and the aulos embodied its most primal edge. Unlike the lyre, which symbolized harmony and order and was favored by the god Apollo, the aulos was directly associated with Dionysus, the god of wine, ecstasy, and madness. It was frequently played during sacred rituals, dramatic theatrical performances, and even military marches, giving it a wide range of emotional and functional uses. It typically consisted of two pipes, usually crafted from wood, bone, or ivory, each with its own reed and fingering holes. The musician, or aulets, played both pipes simultaneously, producing a dense, penetrating sound closer to a bagpipe than a modern flute. This required incredible breath control. Musicians often employed a technique called circular breathing, inhaling through the nose while simultaneously pushing air out through the cheeks, allowing them to play continuously. The effort often subtly warped their faces and significantly puffed out their cheeks, so much so that athletes sometimes mockingly criticized auletes for their awkward appearance. Yet despite the jokes, aulets were respected, even revered in certain circles. The aulos was not intended for calm, background music. It stirred the blood. In ancient Greek theater, it accompanied profound tragedies and comedies, adding powerful mood and dramatic momentum to performances by Sophocles and Euripides. In battle, its blaring voice helped keep hoplites marching in disciplined step, slicing through the chaos of conflict. And during Bacchic rituals, it propelled dancers into trance-like states, dissolving the distinct line between performer and the divinely possessed. Plato had a complex relationship with the aulos. In his Republic, he famously dismissed it as too emotionally overwhelming, preferring instruments like the lyre and kithara for their perceived intellectual clarity. Yet even he couldn't deny its raw power. The aulos could simulate deep sorrow, mimic intense fury, or stir profound euphoria, sometimes all in the very same breath. Today, fragments of ancient aulos pipes survive in museums, and modern reconstructions hint at its raw, untamed energy. Unlike the mathematically balanced lyre, the aulos wasn't about perfection. It was about visceral release. It carried the authentic sound of frenzy, mourning, seduction, and war. In the ancient courts and scholarly studios of China, music was far more than mere art. It was philosophy in motion. And few instruments embody this concept more profoundly than the guqin and the guzheng, two distinct stringed zithers that carried the sounds of dynasties, deep meditation, and poetic introspection. While they may appear similar at a glance, each served a unique and distinct role in shaping China's rich musical identity. The guqin is the elder of the two, an instrument with over 3,000 years of documented history. With 7 strings and a long, fretless wooden body, it produced quiet, incredibly subtle tones. To the untrained ear, the guqin sounds almost whisper-like, gentle slides, ethereal harmonics, and softly plucked notes that echo like raindrops on ancient tile. But to Chinese scholars and sages, these sounds reflected the delicate balance between heaven and earth. Confucius himself was famously said to play the guqin, believing it cultivated moral character and profound inner harmony. In ancient China, learning to play the guqin wasn't about becoming a public performer. It was about becoming truly civilized. Contrast this with the guzheng, a younger, somewhat louder cousin with a brighter, more vibrant sound and a more public life. With 16 to 21 strings, or even more in modern versions, the guzheng was specifically built for performance. Its elegantly curved wooden frame and movable bridges allow for rich, flowing melodies and dramatic glissandos. Musicians pluck the strings with picks attached to their fingers, creating cascades of notes that shimmer like flowing water. It was favored in palaces, played in folk music, and even found its place in military camps. Where the guqin whispered to the soul, the guzheng sang directly to the crowd. Both instruments played significant roles in ritual and storytelling. The guqin often accompanied poetry readings, philosophical lectures, and periods of quiet meditation. The guzheng, conversely, was used in banquets, operas, and to recount sweeping historical epics. Its music could mimic galloping horses, flowing rivers, or the poignant sound of weeping lovers, all skillfully conveyed through vibrating silk strings and masterful fingerwork. These instruments also represented nuanced gendered spaces in ancient China. The guqin was traditionally played by male scholars, while the guzheng became more closely associated with female performers, especially in later dynasties. Yet both were deeply respected, taught in prestigious musical academies, and firmly integrated into the Confucian ideals of a balanced education. Today, both the guqin and guzheng are still actively played, having been revived in both classical and contemporary settings. They remain living echoes of China's ancient soul, where music was not only heard, but profoundly felt as a direct path to virtue and immense emotional depth. In ancient Egypt, music wasn't just background noise. It was a sacred tool, a powerful form of divine communication that resonated through temples, tombs, and every aspect of daily life. From pharaohs to peasants, music was omnipresent. It soothed weary laborers, honored the departed, guided complex religious rituals, and entertained the living. And the instruments that shaped this unique soundscape were as diverse as the Nile River itself. One of the oldest and most iconic Egyptian instruments was the harp. Early harps, gracefully curved like bows, gradually evolved into larger, angular harps that stood as tall as a man. These instruments were played by plucking the strings with the fingers, often by dedicated temple musicians or talented court entertainers. Harps weren't merely for artistic expression. They were intimately associated with the afterlife. Tomb paintings frequently depict harpists playing for the souls of the dead, believed to gently ease their journey into eternity. Then came the sistrum, a sacred rattle intimately associated with the goddess Hathor, the protector of music, motherhood, and joy. Crafted from metal with loose crossbars, the sistrum produced a distinct jangling sound when shaken. It wasn't subtle, but it was undeniably powerful. Used extensively in temples to summon gods, purify sacred spaces, and drive out malevolent spirits, the rhythmic shaking of a sistrum was believed to appease deities and maintain cosmic order. Flutes, often crafted from reed or bone, contributed airy, breathy melodies to religious processions and rituals. The double clarinet, with its two pipes played simultaneously, created a rich, buzzing harmony, serving as a clear predecessor of the Greek aulos. Percussion was provided through frame drums, hand clappers, and even castanets, particularly in dances and festivals. Professional musicians in Egypt held respected positions. Many were women, frequently depicted in art as harpists and singers, often serving in temples. These women were more than mere entertainers. They were chantresses of Amun, musicians of Isis, figures of significant spiritual power. Music served to honor gods, accompany offerings, and mark the profound transitions between life and death. Egyptian musical notation remains largely elusive. Unlike Mesopotamia or Greece, few specific musical records survive, but their instruments, vividly depicted in tombs and temples, tell us a great deal. Ancient Egyptians understood music as intricate structure, profound emotion, and deep magic. Even in death, music was deemed essential. Instruments were carefully buried with the elite, their owners believing they would play again in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. To them, music wasn't a pastime, it was eternity's very language. Long before written words etched history into stone, ancient African cultures utilized something far more primal and immediate: rhythm. Across the vast continent, drums were not just instruments, they were living voices. They spoke, commanded, remembered, and summoned. In Africa's ancient societies, music, especially percussion, was a living, breathing language that carried stories, laws, identities, and the very pulse of the divine. Drums varied widely by region and purpose. But one of the most iconic was the talking drum, found predominantly in West Africa. Shaped like an hourglass and strung with leather cords, this drum could skillfully mimic the tonal languages of the people. Skilled drummers could speak entire phrases by adjusting tension on the cords while striking the drum with a curved stick. Messages were effectively sent across villages, announcing births, deaths, warnings, or royal summons. Long before the invention of paper or the postal system, the drum became the continent's first sophisticated wireless communication system. But drums weren't just practical, they were deeply spiritual. In kingdoms like ancient Kush and Nok, drums summoned ancestors and deities. In Ife and Benin, they honored kings and gods in elaborate court rituals. Drumming was central to initiation ceremonies, healing rituals, and funerals. It was said that to beat a sacred drum was to awaken forces beyond the veil. African drums came in countless forms: djembe, dundun, bugarabu, and keet, each with specific roles in the intricate musical hierarchy. They were carved from single logs, meticulously hollowed and fitted with animal hide, each tuned to a specific pitch or tone. The craftsmanship was sacred, passed down from father to son, with rituals observed even during the making of the instrument. And percussion didn't stop at drums. Rattles, bells, shakers, and thumb pianos added rich layers of rhythm and melody, creating a complex polyrhythmic soundscape that Western music wouldn't fully comprehend until centuries later. In African tradition, music was inseparable from movement. You didn't just listen, you danced, breathed, and sweated with it. The drummer wasn't a mere performer. He was a conduit, channeling energy, spirit, and communal memory. These powerful rhythms traveled through the trans-Saharan trade routes, through the Nile, and later, tragically, through the Atlantic slave trade, shaping diasporic music from Brazil to the Caribbean. But their heart remained always in Africa, where the beat wasn't just entertainment, it was identity, ancestry, and profound survival. High in the Andean mountains, where the air thins and the clouds brush the earth, music floated through the stone cities and terraced fields, not from strings or drums, but from the very wind itself. Ancient Andean civilizations like the Nazca, Moche, and Inca developed a rich musical tradition centered around aerophones, flutes, whistles, and most famously, panpipes, or siku. The siku is a deceptively simple-looking instrument. It consists of multiple reeds or bamboo tubes of varying lengths, lashed together in a single row or sometimes stacked in double rows. Each tube plays one note, and players alternate rapidly between rows to create intricate melodies. The result is a haunting, breathy harmony that echoes across mountains like a deep conversation with the wind itself. Siku ensembles were often played in pairs, with two players performing alternating notes in interlocking patterns, a technique called hocketing, which symbolized the Andean ideal of duality and balance in both nature and society. Flutes, crafted from bone, clay, or reed, were also widespread. Some were so small they could hang from necklaces. Others were large enough to produce deep, resonant tones. Many were intricately carved in the shapes of birds, snakes, or spirits, clearly demonstrating the strong spiritual link between sound and the natural world. These were not merely musical instruments, they were sacred tools. Music was utilized to call for rain, bless harvests, honor the sun, or communicate with ancestors. One particularly fascinating discovery is the ceramic whistling vessels of the Moche civilization. When water was poured into them, internal chambers forced air through a whistle, producing eerie tones, quite literally, musical pottery. These were likely used in rituals, cleverly combining water, air, and sound into a single ceremonial act. In Inca society, music accompanied every significant stage of life. From birth celebrations to funerals, from military parades to agricultural festivals, there was a specific melody for every moment. Inca musicians played for gods like Inti, the sun, and Pachamama, the earth, offering their very breath as a profound form of spiritual devotion. Even soldiers marched with coordinated flute music, transforming warfare into a kind of ritual choreography. Though Spanish colonization nearly erased many native traditions, the distinctive sound of Andean flutes never fully vanished. Today, their echoes can still be heard in the Peruvian highlands and Bolivian villages, an ancient voice of stone, wind, and sky, still singing melodically in the thin air. In ancient India, music was far more than a performance. It was considered a form of cosmic engineering. According to Hindu philosophy, the universe itself was believed to have been created from sound, originating from the primordial vibration known as Om. From this profound belief grew one of the world's most intricate and enduring musical traditions, deeply rooted in ritual, mathematics, and spiritual transformation. Early texts like the Vedas, dating back to at least 1500 BCE, already contain hymns known as Saman chants, which were meant to be sung, not just recited. These hymns formed part of sacred rituals with specific melodies designed to align the soul with divine forces. The priestly class, the Brahmins, were meticulously trained not only in philosophy and fire offerings, but also in voice modulation and precise musical cadence. Absolute precision was essential. Mispronouncing a note could, in theory, corrupt the entire ritual. The earliest instruments used in Vedic and post-Vedic India served both sonic and symbolic roles. The veena, a plucked string instrument with a resonating gourd, became a powerful symbol of learning and divine expression. It was, and still is, intimately associated with the goddess Saraswati, the deity of wisdom and the arts. Its strings were believed to echo the very vibrations of the cosmos, allowing the player to connect with universal truths through melody. Wind instruments like the bansuri, bamboo flute, were not only tools for creating melody, but also powerful vehicles of myth. Lord Krishna, the god of love and divine play, was frequently depicted playing the flute, charming humans and animals alike. The sound of the bansuri was believed to pierce the illusions of reality, Maya, and transport listeners to a higher state of consciousness. Percussion also held immense power. The mridangam and tabla weren't just rhythm keepers. They mirrored heartbeats, breath patterns, and cosmic cycles. Rhythms, or talas, were complex mathematical patterns, some cyclical, some asymmetrical, each intricately linked to specific emotional states and times of day. Indian music was deeply tied to rasa theory, the belief that music should evoke specific emotional flavors like love, heroism, serenity, or sorrow. Even in ancient times, ragas, melodic frameworks, were meticulously designed to stir the soul and guide meditation. Unlike many ancient traditions that have been lost to time, India's musical roots have not only survived, they have continuously evolved. But at their very core remains the same ancient belief that to make music is to deeply touch the divine. In the ancient cities of Mesoamerica, from the towering pyramids of Teotihuacan to the ceremonial plazas of the Maya and Aztecs, music was utterly inseparable from the sacred. It wasn't merely art, it was profound power, utilized to commune with gods, sanctify blood offerings, summon rain, and terrify enemies. For the peoples of Mesoamerica, music was, in essence, ritual technology, an invisible thread linking humans to the divine and the realm of the dead. Drums dominated the soundscape. The most iconic was the huehuetl, a tall, single-headed drum carved from hollowed tree trunks and played with bare hands. Covered in animal skins and adorned with intricate glyphs or sacred images, the huehuetl throbbed during festivals, warfare, and sacrifices. Its deep, resonant sound echoed through stone courtyards like the very heartbeat of the gods. Then came the teponaztli, a slit drum made of hollowed wood, played with rubber-tipped mallets. Its surface was carved into two tongues that produced different pitches when struck. The teponaztli wasn't just percussive, it could speak. In Nahuatl, the Aztec language, it was said that the teponaztli could sing the names of deities or the rhythmic patterns of fate itself. Wind instruments were also central to their musical traditions. Flutes made of bone, clay, and reed were common, often shaped like animals or gods. Some were so intricately made that they could mimic bird calls, jaguar growls, or even human screams. In fact, the infamous Aztec death whistle, shaped like a skull and blown like a flute, produces a blood-chilling shriek, possibly used during warfare or sacrificial ceremonies to strike terror into enemies or to open portals to the spirit world. Music accompanied every major event: birth, coming-of-age rites, warfare, agricultural cycles, and death. Musicians and dancers trained in special schools, performing not just for crowds, but directly for the gods. Certain instruments were strictly reserved for nobles or priests. Playing them incorrectly could be considered a spiritual offense. Even sacrifice, a central practice in Aztec religion, was carried out to a meticulous musical score. Drums pounded, flutes wailed, and conch shells howled while hearts were offered to the sun. The music didn't soothe, it activated. It guided souls, fed gods, and kept the cosmic engine turning. In Mesoamerica, music wasn't a mere backdrop, it was the ceremony. It wasn't meant to entertain, it was meant to transform. Though the civilizations of antiquity have long since risen and fallen, their music has never truly died. It continues to linger, not always in audible sound, but in ritual design, in cultural memory, and deeply within our very cultural DNA. In many ways, ancient music was never intended to be preserved in written sheet music or captured in recordings. It was passed down through hands, through mouths, and through hearts, a living tradition meticulously encoded in memory and vibrant performance. Consider the Chinese guqin or the Indian veena. These are not mere museum pieces. They are still actively played today, often utilizing techniques that have been passed down for millennia. Performers don't simply mimic ancient sounds, they embody them. Each note carries centuries of philosophy, culture, and deep meditation. In a single pluck, you can feel the same profound longing or exquisite joy that an ancient emperor or a wise sage once experienced. In Africa, the drums continue to speak. The rhythms of the djembe, the call and response of the kora, the syncopation of traditional dance, all echo ancient practices that predate colonial maps or written history. Even in the Americas, the haunting breath of the Andean siku, or the thunder of powwow drums among indigenous tribes, reflects the powerful echoes of ancestral voices. Some instruments are direct descendants, others are inspired reinventions, but the profound roots are undeniably ancient. Even in modern Western music, ancient concepts remarkably survive. The seven-note heptatonic scale, first used in Mesopotamia, laid a fundamental groundwork for modern harmony. Greek music theory, its modes, intervals, and concept of ethos, fed directly into early Christian chant and the eventual birth of classical music. And the instruments themselves? The lyre evolved into the lute, which in turn birthed the guitar. The aulos's double reed design inspired the oboe and the bassoon. But perhaps the most enduring legacy is the profound purpose of ancient music. It wasn't meant to sell tickets or top charts. It was ritual. It was healing. It marked birth and death, sowing and harvest, love and war. It truly meant something. Even today, music remains our universal language, capable of stirring deep emotion without words, of creating community without physical walls. In a digital world, often overflowing with distracting noise, ancient music serves as a poignant reminder that sound can be sacred, that rhythm can be memory, and that melody can be a powerful thread connecting worlds. Whether whispered from a guqin, shouted through a war drum, or piped from a clay flute, the songs of our ancestors still echo. We just need to listen.